Happy Halloween, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth for PC and Xbox. What you're seeing here is the PC version, and special thanks to Mr. Jensen for sending me a copy of this to take a look at. You'll normally see this described as a survival horror game, although that was really more of a common parlance of the era this came out. You gotta keep in mind the original release was on the original Xbox in 2005, and a few months later on the PC, and back then most people described pretty much every horror game in existence as survival horror, whether the term actually applies or not. In this particular case, I would really just describe this more as a horror first-person shooter, although certainly not in the same vein as something like, say, Fear, where it's much more of a first-person shooter than it is a horror game. This one does lean much more heavily into the horror aspects, but we'll get to that more a bit later on. Upon its original release, the game was pretty decently received, although it did receive quite a bit of criticism for the rather large amount of technical problems the game had, which unfortunately never got patched, although there is a fan-made patch that will at least fix some of the issues that it has in that regard. And another piece of criticism I see all the time with this thing is that the game is too difficult, although I think a lot of that's really directed more at the Xbox version than the PC version. Unfortunately, despite the game's pretty decent reception, it didn't sell all that well, and thus plans for 2 sequels ended up being scrapped when the studio that developed it ended up going under. It wasn't doomed to total obscurity, however, because in subsequent years it had become something of a cult classic, and it would regularly appear on lists of top horror games and things like that. Now, before I go any further, I do want to mention that what you're seeing in this video is not the game in its vanilla state. I am running this thing with 2 modifications. The first of them is just a simple widescreen patch. The game only supports 4:3 resolutions by default, which is a fairly common issue for games of that era, so obviously a widescreen patch is pretty much a must for modern monitors. As for the other modification I'm running, it is the fan patch, or just DCOTE patch, which is meant to fix a few of the more egregious glitches in the game, which will actually prevent you from being able to progress. So it's also basically a must on modern systems, and it also lets you adjust the FOV, which is also a must because the default field of view is 55 degrees. That is an extremely low FOV, even by console standards, where console first-person shooters are normally around 65 degrees. And while some of you out there might be complaining that changing the FOV makes this a bit less of a horror game, allow me to enlighten you as to a simple reality of the situation. If I were to play this thing at its default field of view, I would have been vomiting several times while playing this thing. Not just because the FOV is extremely low and that induces nausea in and of itself, but because the game has so many blurring effects that constantly come up on the screen because of the game's sanity mechanics that I would have been pushed well over the edge into vomiting territory. So if you're looking at these graphics and you're thinking, wow, there's a lot of weird issues with the arms where they're just really long and really spindly and not really animating properly, that's probably because it's being played at 90 field of view as opposed to the 55 default FOV. But unfortunately, that's the price you have to pay if you're one of those people for whom low field of view induces motion sickness. Either you play this thing at a higher FOV and you deal with the jank, or you play it at a low field of view, you play it for about 5 minutes, you throw up, and then you uninstall and never play it again. And if you're one of those people for whom low field of view doesn't induce motion sickness, consider yourself lucky. Now then, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. How it is as a piece of Lovecraftian fiction, adapting the Cthulhu mythos and such, as well as how it is as an action horror game in general, and whether or not it still holds up after all these years. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, I need to get the obvious out of the way first. I've already talked about how bad the FOV is by default, and how the game has a lot of really nasty blurring effects whenever the sanity mechanic starts coming into play, and how that all becomes very nauseating very quickly. Even with the increased FOV, the blurring effects actually do start to get pretty irritating because they actually destroy the frame rate. It seems like whenever there's a screen effect, like water droplets or blood splatter or, of course, the blurring effects, it just absolutely destroys the game's frame rate, and I have absolutely no idea why. Speaking of frame rate, that's another issue with the game. If you run this thing at anything higher than 60 frames per second, it breaks the game. And I don't mean the game runs too fast, I mean that if it runs faster than 60 frames per second, then it triggers some game-breaking glitches, so you have to limit the frame rate to 60 in the hopes that you won't run into those glitches. Even then, it's still a bit of a crapshoot. And now that we've covered a lot of the engine woes, what about the actual visuals themselves? Well, this is a game from 2005, and for the time it looked not particularly great. The modeling and texture quality in particular are pretty rough at times, and what passes for lip sync in the game is pretty awful. Those are relatively typical issues for games of that time, however, so it's not really something I hold against the game too much. What I do hold against it, however, is the color scheme, which is to say that this game is basically nothing but brown and gray. Which, of course, unlike games like, say, Call of Duty World at War, where they thought it made the game gritty and realistic, in this particular case is meant to be more oppressive and conducive to a horror atmosphere, but that only works if the game actually has that atmosphere, which Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth does not. Now, it might trick you into thinking that because the opening sections of the game do have more of an oppressive and horror-like atmosphere, but very quickly that atmosphere is shattered and the game never recovers from it, so it just ends up looking drab and monotonous most of the time. It also doesn't help that the game has a film grain effect that is pervasive throughout the entire game, but is intensified during cutscenes. Cutscenes which are unskippable, by the way, which is a problem that I will explain a bit more when I get to the gameplay section. So the visuals really weren't all that great when the game originally released, and they certainly haven't aged very well either. But what about the sound design? Well, for the most part, that still holds up pretty decently. The sound effects themselves are certainly quite functional, although a fair few of them sound like they were taken out of a generic sound library and maybe dressed up a bit, and there's really not going to be any sound effects that truly impress you, although they do a pretty decent job with the atmospheric sounds at the beginning of the game, as long as it is retaining that horror-like atmosphere. Then, of course, there's the soundtrack, which is pretty decent for the most part. It certainly fits the forlorn Lovecraftian horror vibe that the game is trying to go for, but that only helps so much when the game is the way it is. But don't worry, we'll get to that eventually. And finally, with regards to sound design, there is the voice acting, which is not terrible for 2005. Now, granted, that's not really saying all that much, but suffice to say, the voice acting is what I would describe as B-horror movie level quality. More often than not, voices that are supposed to be unsettling will actually just amuse you, and when somebody's trying to be more serious, usually they just don't have the gravitas to be able to convey that. So when you bring all of the presentation together, you end up with something that is very rough. Even at the time it released, it was something of a mess, and even without me having to mess with the field of view to get this game into something resembling a playable state, the visuals and the engine in particular just have not aged well at all. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Detective Jack Walters, first a police detective, then, when the main events of the game take place, a private detective, who starts off the game showing up at the scene of a siege against a dilapidated manor, which is currently housing a strange cult that have asked for Walters by name. He's understandably confused by this and decides to go and investigate. As he approaches the manor, a firefight ensues, and in the confusion he ends up going in the back way, where he finds all manner of strange things that the cult was doing, and eventually makes his way into the basement where he finds many corpses and a lot of very strange machinery, whose purpose is not very clear, but it is pretty horrifying. As he continues to explore the area, he finds something that is clearly not of this world, and as he starts messing around with it, he ends up opening a portal. Jack doesn't get much time to process this, however, as two strange beings emerge from the portal, and Jack ends up blacking out. From there, the game skips forward several years, and Jack is remarking to himself in his journal about how the last 6 years have just been a complete blank period. He has no idea what happened there, except for some fragments here and there that don't really make a whole lot of sense. It's at this point where Jack is working as a private detective, and he gets a call about a new job, a missing persons case in the town of Innsmouth. Really needing the money and not really having much better to do, he does end up taking the job and makes his way to Innsmouth, where he begins his search for the missing person, Brian Burnham, an employee of the First National grocery store chain. And almost immediately, it is painfully obvious that something is not right in Innsmouth. The town is dilapidated, buildings are boarded up, the people are completely unhelpful and very standoffish, and the more Jack investigates, the more the locals start to antagonize him, and the more he starts having these strange visions. Eventually, the locals have had enough of Jack snooping around, and they decide to eliminate him. So what ensues is a frantic attempt at an escape from Innsmouth, all the while finding all of the dark secrets that the town had been hiding from him up to that point. During your investigations, you'll find out that the town has been taken over by a strange cult called the Esoteric Order of Dagon, which is up to all manner of horrible things, and trying to bring horrible eldritch monstrosities into this world. And that's all well and good. The opening sections of the game are really the strongest part of it, because you're venturing into places where you really don't belong, and you are not welcome there. And as you continue to poke around into things that they don't want you to find out, you're getting a really nice, strong, oppressive vibe that fits in very well with the Lovecraftian themes. But despite a very strong opening in that regard, once you actually manage to escape from Innsmouth the first time, you run into J. Edgar Hoover, and he ropes you into going back into Innsmouth and taking on the cult directly. And from there on out, the plot basically collapses in on itself, because it can't really decide whether it wants to be a horror game or a first-person shooter, so it tries to do both and just fails spectacularly at both. Because nothing screams Lovecraftian horror, where humanity's place in the universe is completely insignificant, and these beings are completely beyond human understanding, quite like mowing down hordes of cultists and deep ones with mundane weaponry, and kicking the eldritch monstrosities back from whence they came in similarly mundane capacity. Jack basically ends up being forced into becoming the big damn hero upon whose shoulders the fate of the entire world rests. And thus you basically end up having action movie shenanigans in a game that is ostensibly supposed to be Lovecraftian horror. In reality, once you get past the fairly strong opening section and you get into the real meat of the game, you end up with a plot that can't decide whether it wants to be a horror game or an action game, so it does both and fails miserably at them, resulting in a game where you really can't get invested in the story at all, and by the time you do finally get to the end of it, and it tries to bring things back into the oppressive Lovecraftian horror vibe, you just don't care anymore. And a lot of the reason you're not going to care by the time you get to the ending is simply because the gameplay drags everything else down with it. As I said, this game can't decide whether it wants to be a horror game or a first-person shooter, so it tries to do both. And it's actually a bit deceptive about it at first, because the game starts off with you having absolutely no offensive capabilities whatsoever. It's basically a first-person adventure game at that point. You're walking around taking in that very oppressive, you don't belong here vibe. You're finding clues as to what ultimately happened to the missing person that you're looking for and the strange goings-on in town. You're spotting things out of the corner of your eye going, what was that? And getting those weird visions that really increase the tension. And as that tension builds up, eventually it culminates in the escape from the hotel, where you become aware of the townsfolk deciding that you've snooped around long enough and they ultimately try to take you down, resulting in a chase sequence where you're trying to flee desperately from them and find a place to hide and recover so you can try to get out of Innsmouth. And that whole section of the game is interesting and tense. And then the actual chase sequence happens, and you are confronted with the game's mechanics. And that's where everything falls apart. That's not necessarily to say that the game doesn't have some interesting ideas in it. The damage and healing system, for example, is actually pretty interesting. You have numerous locations on your body that can take different kinds of damage, and you can heal that damage by using different medical supplies. So, for example, some things will just require bandages, whereas other things might require you to splint a limb, or you might have to suture some wounds. And whenever you find health packs, you're not actually just getting a flat health bonus, you're getting more of those supplies. If you don't have those supplies, then you can't heal that particular type of wound. and as you continue to take these wounds, they will affect you in different ways. For example, if you take arm damage, then it makes it harder to aim at things. If you take leg damage, then you'll start limping around and moving a lot more slowly. And if you take wounds that require sutures, then you need to treat those almost immediately, otherwise you'll eventually bleed out. And healing isn't an instantaneous matter like it is in a lot of other games. You actually have to go through an animation where you start patching yourself up in order for the healing to actually work. In theory, that's going to ratchet up the tension. Since healing actually takes time and effort, you don't want to get injured, which means you're going to try to avoid combat more. And that's going to be compounded by the very minimal HUD, and by minimal HUD I mean completely non-existent heads-up display, where you don't have things like an ammo counter or a health meter or even a crosshair. If you want to aim at something, you need to aim down the sights of your gun, or if it's a shotgun or a machine gun or something like that, then you do more of a zoom and just kind of point it in the general direction of the thing you're trying to shoot. And if you want to keep track of how much ammunition you have in your magazine, then you need to count the rounds that you're sending down range. And if you're leaning left or right when you're aiming down the sights, you'll actually cant the weapon just a bit, so you're not actually aiming down the sights anymore, and you need to compensate for your aim a bit. In theory, this makes the combat a much more tense and dangerous affair than you would see in basically any other first-person shooter out there. In practice, however, it is a completely different story. The simple fact of the matter is that the AI is so astoundingly bad in this game that a lot of times you can just kind of leisurely walk past enemies and they'll barely notice you. If they do notice you and start shooting, it is a complete crapshoot as to whether or not they're actually going to hit you. I've seen enemies hit me from seemingly impossible angles and almost impossible distances, and yet I've also seen them miss me completely when standing right next to me. I have witnessed enemies standing right next to each other, and when you blast one of them and he falls over dead, the other guy doesn't even notice, and it's not even like that is an uncommon thing to happen. It also doesn't help that the stealth mechanics are completely broken thanks to how bad this AI is. Sometimes they'll spot you. Other times, even though you're doing the exact same thing that got you spotted before, you somehow don't get spotted. And since the game is actually pretty generous with the ammunition, once you do actually get access to the firearms anyway, you can basically just start blasting your way through every single encounter because there's not really anything that's going to stand against you at that point. And the very few times you'll run into enemies where bullets aren't the solution, it's basically just a set-piece moment. But ironically enough, even though the combat and the stealth in this game are absolute jokes, the general gameplay experience without the combat is somehow even worse, because the AI is still that dumb and that broken, but you have no way of defending yourself against it. So when the AI inevitably gets lucky and gets enough rounds on target for you to finally drop, you're having to load saves. And since this game doesn't let you save anywhere you want, and you have to rely on save points, you'll find yourself having to sit through the game's unskippable cutscenes over and over and over again, and that gets incredibly annoying. So funnily enough, the game does give you a sense of dread that you might associate with a proper horror experience, except it's not that you're dreading things because the game's atmosphere is so good that you're really tense about what might be around the next corner. No, you're dreading continuing because you know the game's jankiness and general brokenness is going to screw you over yet again, and you're going to have to sit through a cutscene that you cannot skip through over and over and over again until eventually you manage to brute force your way through it. This kind of thing completely destroys any tension that the game was possibly achieving, and that even includes at the very beginning of the game when the game is at its most tense. Ironically enough, the hotel escape sequence, which is generally cited as one of the most tense sections of the entire game and a high mark of the game, is also one of the weakest points, because that is when you are going to notice this problem. And once that tension is lost, once you realize how janky this game is, it never recovers from it. And you can't even really enjoy it in a so bad it's good sense, because it just keeps getting on your nerves. It reeks of a game that got stuck in development hell and had to get redesigned several times, which is exactly what happened to it. There was originally supposed to be a PlayStation 2 version, but they ended up having to scrap it. The game was originally supposed to release in 2001, but it ended up getting pushed back to 2005 for the original Xbox, and then 2006 for the PC. It was originally meant to have more content, a non-linear storyline, multiplayer in both cooperative and competitive modes, as well as a more expansive sanity system and more environmental interactions, making it much more of an immersive sim kind of thing. But they ended up having to cut out most of the features they wanted to put in the game to begin with, and you end up with this weird freak of a game where it can't really figure out exactly what it wants to be, and what it ultimately ended up being was just so broken that it's barely playable at best. Hell, even the sanity mechanic isn't handled very well. It's supposed to get more intensive as you continue to look at the very unsettling elements of the world. Things like Jack having a fear of heights, so if you look down from a height, it will start messing with the sanity. Or if you look at horrible eldritch monstrosities, then it will definitely mess with it. And all that ends up doing is heavily blurring the screen and making your heart rate go crazy. And if you don't look away from those things and try to spend a few seconds recovering, then it will eventually just push you into a game over and you'll have to load a save. And when a Call of Cthulhu game can't even handle its sanity mechanic all that well, then you have a serious problem. And yet, despite this game being a broken, barely playable mess at absolute best, you can regularly find it on best horror games of all time lists. And the only thing I can figure about that is that the people who put it on those lists have only played the first maybe 20 or 30 minutes of the game and then completely disregard every single other thing that's in it. Because once you're past those opening sections, everything from there on out just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And the worst part about it is because of all of that hype that the game gets, you keep telling yourself, no, it has to get better eventually. But it never does. And at the end of the day, Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is a 1 out of 5 on my scale. Honestly, if you want the Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth experience, but don't want to suffer through the entire gameplay experience that is an absolutely broken mess, just go read The Shadow over Innsmouth and The Shadow Out of Time. You'll have an infinitely more enjoyable experience with those. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all enjoy your Halloween.